Let's start with the tariff war.
Mhm.
What I find interesting is that he's saying he's calling it a Liberation Day, Economic Independence Day. So it's like a great victory. At the same time, he also declares a state of emergency, right? So it's like a crisis as well. What exactly is he doing? What is his message? What's going on here?
Well, I think the simplest way to understand this is to understand that this is an American retreat. It is a product of America's relative decline. Now, you have to go all the way back to understand a little bit about the context of this. I mean, America developed its economy in the 19th, early 20th century behind protectionist walls. I mean, it did that basically from the time of the American Civil War until basically the Second World War. Um, then, after the Second World War, you had this brief period when the United States was far and away the most economically powerful, most industrialized country in the world. Now, it's important to understand that in the period just after the Second World War, the United States' economy was bigger than that of all of the rest of the world combined. I mean, it was proportionately huge. The Americans at that time wanted to establish themselves as the great leader, the hegemon, and it was quite openly discussed and set out at the time. There were articles about, the American century appearing all over the American media and whatever. And what that basically meant was integrating the world economy into the bigger American economy. I mean, that was how it was basically conceived. And so you had Bretton Woods, and then after Bretton Woods, there was the second wave, which was the 1971 Nixon shock, where the Americans cut the connection to gold, but managed to preserve the dollar's position as the reserve currency and all of that. So it's important to understand also that when I said integrate the world economy into the bigger American economy, it was done in a way that would subordinate, in American conception, subordinate the bigger the world economy to the American. The rest of the world would basically support and sustain the American economy, enabling Americans to continue to be materially richer and more powerful. Then what happened, and what's happened over the last 30, 40 years, is that the world has grown much, much bigger. The United States is now a diminished part of the world economy. It's suddenly understood that it's been overtaken in manufacturing, in technology, in science by other countries, most importantly China. And this is ultimately all about China. Remember what I always say, everything ultimately comes down to China. So the United States is no longer, and I don't think it's just Trump here, the United States no longer wants to pursue the kind of policies that it had in the period after the Second World War. And it says to itself, how did we become strong? We became strong previously through high protective barriers, and we're going to bring them back, and we're going to make them even higher than they were before, because these are the highest tariffs that America has ever imposed in its history. I understand the trade weighted level of these tariffs is 29%.
Mhm.
And they are mainly directed at America's great industrial technological competitor, which is China. So, in theory, tariffs have only been increased on China by 34%, already huge.
Mhm.
But this comes on top of an earlier increase in tariffs of 20%. So it's 54% tariffs on Chinese goods. Now, this is a product of decline and failure. It is a retreat. It is an acknowledgement of America's lack of industrial, technological, economic competitiveness. And so if you think of it in that way, it is not surprising that there's a declaration of economic emergency connected to it, because that is how America feels. America feels that it is losing not just its position as the major economic power, but that it is now at risk of being decisively overtaken as an economic power. And so it's thrashing around, and it's doing what lots of people do in these kind of situations. They say, well, what worked in the past, let's go back to that. Let's go back to the golden age of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. We grew our economy then behind tariff walls. So that worked then. Why shouldn't it work now? And that's what we're going to try to do this time.
Well, when you say it worked in the past, I guess it's you're referring to, and Trump referring to the McKinley period, right? That
That's
he
right.
increased
Yeah.
the tariffs. At the same
He's
time,
obsessed by it. He's obsessed by it. He doesn't understand it at all, by the way. But that's another thing, actually. Carry on.
yeah, but also Hoover also increased the tariffs, and many
Yeah.
people believe that Hoover's action increase the tariffs is direct reason, at least a major contributor to the Great Depression. So it's not necessarily high tariffs guarantees anything. It all depends on, I guess, a lot of other factors, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. Can I just say, I mean, one thing that Trump seems completely unaware of is that, yes, McKinley did increase tariffs, and then he decided it was all a big mistake, and he was going to reduce them again. And towards the end of his life, he was thinking of going back to free trade, except, of course, he was assassinated before he could do it. So, I mean, he's got the whole history completely scrambled in his own mind. Now, there was a period just after the Civil War and for some time afterwards when you could argue that it made a kind of sense for the Americans to do that. But it's also important to understand that during that very same period, the United States was the beneficiary of massive investment by the imperial power, the great imperial power of that era, which was Britain, in the American economy. People like J.P. Morgan and people like that. J.P. Morgan was the reason he became so powerful in the United States was because he was the person who was the contact point between Britain and America, and who was organizing the financial flows. And the reason the British were investing in America at that time was because that was what the British did. They saw a country that was like themselves in some respects. It spoke the same language as they did. It was huge. It made Britain itself richer and economically more powerful. And it helped Britain because the British said to themselves, well, our own power is in decline. We need America to become stronger so that it can take the burden to some extent off our shoulders. And we can use that to extend our own power as well. All of this is very well documented. There's lots of books written about this, but it operated in a completely different time period. These tariffs at that time, they were done in effect by agreement with the main economic power of that period, which was Britain. And they were intended to help fledgling industries in an economy that was industrializing. The United States is not a fledgling economy which is industrializing today. It is a mature economy. It is profoundly different from the economy of the late 19th, early 20th centuries. So you are prescribing a medicine to a patient who is not the same patient that you think. And you're absolutely correct. In the 1930s, there's no doubt at all, the Smoot-Hartley tariffs of the 1920s which were lower, by the way, than the Trump tariffs, actually contributed to the Great Depression. They contributed significantly to the Great Depression. One of the things they did was that the Americans, for example, were owed a huge amount of money by Europe after the First World War, because the Americans loaned money to the British. They were lending money to the British, to the United States, to Germany as well, because Germany was having to pay reparations to Britain and France. It did that by borrowing money from the Americans. But all of these countries couldn't pay back their debts to the United States because America was blocking their exports. So the result was it actually fed a kind of debt doom loop of debt, which led to the great economic, which was one of the contributing factors, which led to the economic crisis of the 30s. So, I mean, you could say so much about this. Or it is a mistaken policy for the problems that afflict America today. What America should be doing is not hiding behind walls. It should be pursuing policies of peace. But of course, that isn't something that today's America is able to do or even conceive of.
Yeah. What I find interesting is the way Trump is very interesting in terms of, he's describing, right? The United States has been interfering different countries' internal policies and stirring up troubles all over the place, right? We all know 90% of world trouble conflicts, US has played some role. And yet he's make it sounds like US is being mistreated. Here, US is almost like a victim, right? He's saying that US has been disrespected and mistreated, and now he's trying to correct it. So that sounds like to me like US is the big victim here, has been victimized by the rest of the world. It just his way of describing things. And then there's a whole, he's using the word reciprocal, which is, I find very, very misleading, the reciprocal, right? Because if you look at the list, he put it out. Now, China, he put it 67%. It sounds like China is having 67% of the US tariffs on the US goods, which is not true at all. He just used the deficit and divide the US exporting to China, and that's the 67%. And he calls it the reciprocal. Very, very misleading. So what I find, and then of course the stock market tanked. Now, is he trying to, I mean, what exactly his message? And he is introduced some kind of a shock therapy for the United States. He doesn't seem too much bothered by the fact that the stock market tanked, which he was last time. His first term, he cares deeply about the stock market, but he doesn't care anymore. Does he already convince himself this is a shock therapy that needed for the United States? Is that what it is?
In his own self-conception, probably that is what he thinks.
Okay.
I don't think he has understood this at all, to be honest. And like a lot of people who understand very simple things, who think in very simple terms, which is what Trump does, he assumes that things are much easier and easier to solve than they really are. You see this with his attempts to end the conflict in Ukraine. He seems to think, you sort of tell people let's have a ceasefire, they'll agree. And of course they won't agree because it's more complicated than that. A lot of people are like this. It makes for very effective politics. It doesn't make for very good economics. I mean, that's the first thing to say. Now, this sense of America as the victim is so American. It's so much the spoiled child who blames his toys, when he falls and breaks them. I mean, because that's exactly what it is. I mean, I said that the whole, what he's destroying or trying to, what he's blaming for America's economic problems is a global economic system that America itself created in order to uphold American power. Just like, I mean, and here there's a good article by a friend of mine, Ian Proud, who's a former British diplomat. He's blaming Ukraine for, stealing all this money from the United States. But the reason Ukraine is in the position that it is in is because the Americans overthrew its government, brought to power all of these people who are there, encouraged Ukraine to be as anti-Russian as possible, led Ukraine into this conflict with Russia, and yet it's all going wrong. So what do? You blame Ukraine. You even see this. There's a big article in the New York Times about how the Americans were running the war in Ukraine, but it all fails, not because the Americans made any mistakes, but because the Ukrainians didn't understand these wonderful plans that the Americans were writing for them. This is very, very much an American characteristic. You don't take responsibility. You don't accept responsibility for your own problems. You always blame someone else. You always look for someone else to blame. It's always the Chinese, or the Russians, or the Ukrainians. I don't know if you've ever seen, there's a hilarious film from the early 70s, which captures this brilliantly, which is all about, motor cars, a motor car race where people go around and kill pedestrians. And this is a new game that America has. Anyway, there it's the French. You're blaming the French for all of America's economic problems. And that's what we see today with this. Blame other people, blame the world. And as you absolutely rightly say, back of the envelope calculations on these so-called tariffs that other countries allegedly are imposing on the United States. Don't acknowledge that there are problems with your own industrial system. Don't recognize that your own cars are less efficient than other people's cars, or are unsuited to other people's roads and urban lifestyles, or that they're too expensive to run, or that they're too unreliable. Just pretend to yourself it's because these other countries are imposing some kind of tariffs against you, which only exist in your own mind. Then you come up with some kind of back of the envelope calculation, and then say to yourself, well, they're doing all this unfair thing, they're screwing us, and so we're going to have reciprocal tariffs on them. I mean, it's tragic, actually, to see a country like the United States do this. But they do this all the time. They've been talking like this all of their existence. I can never remember a time when America ever really acknowledged that it had made mistakes, and that many of the problems that were afflicting it were of its own making.
Well, I think sometimes you hear prominent figures, they would admit. I remember
Yeah.
Hillary Clinton actually said, um, what we did, we screwed up in Afghanistan. I mean, she actually knows pretty well, and she laid them out what the mistake we made there. I was very impressed at that time. Like, it's not like people like her doesn't know what's going on. They just
Yes.
once she got, I mean, that was a not very official kind of interview. She was talking to somebody, I forgot what. But anyway, and she's not the only person. I think Obama, from time to time, you hear something spell out as well. So it's not like they don't know. I think they know. I mean, they're too smart to not to know this, but they just
Yes.
don't officially admit that, right? They just
Yes.
have an official narrative that everybody else.
Well, you are completely correct, and this is where I think something to understand about America. About America, marketing is the thing. It's very much a part of America's life, and so when you are all about that advertising, marketing, that kind of thing, you have you develop a very distorted view of how to explain things all the time. You may know that your product is awful, but you're not going to say so. And you may know that your foreign policy has made some terrible mistakes and done some awful things, but you don't say so. And you may know that your economic policy has been ruinous, but you don't say so. And the same goes with, other things you do. And that I'm afraid is very much an American characteristic. You're absolutely right. The American elite at some level is well aware of where things are actually wrong, but they will never admit it, never really admit it, and never really convey it to the American people in a consistent way. I mean, Iraq is a good example. I mean, there's been lots of things said about the Iraq war. There's been sort of admissions that it was all a big mistake. But nobody really has addressed the whole history of American relations with Iraq, going back long before the war. There's never been that genuine accounting, which would make it possible to avoid making those kind of mistakes again.
Yeah, just look at the Kennedy files now that it's out with so much details. But I think the official narrative is still this one man with one bullet. That's it. They even didn't say, okay, that doesn't. It simply is not true. Now, exactly what happened, we may not know. We may never know, but it certainly is not one person, one bullet. At least, throw that out the window. Officially, they have not. So
No,
even though
and they never
everybody
will.
knows that simply is not true, but it doesn't matter.
Exactly, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Exactly. You know,
Okay, so
other societies are not like that.
yeah.
Just to say,
Uh-huh.
China is not like that. Russia is not like that either, by the way. In fact, the Russians go to the other extreme. They beat themselves up all the time. But that's another story.
Well, yeah, China do a lot of soul searching. Yes, and for
Yeah,
this 100 years humiliation, there's a lot of soul
yeah,
searching what went wrong internally, right?
yeah,
It's not just blaming the British, the Japanese,
yeah.
but there were lots of officially also a
Oh,
lot
I
of
know there are. I
yeah.
know there are,
So
absolutely. But as
yeah.
I say, America never does that. That is not something that America ever really does. As I say, it's always wicked foreigners taking advantage of the dear, gentle, well-meaning, well-intentioned United States.
Yeah. Tom and Daisy, the Great Gatsby, the Tom and Daisy phenomenon.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, exactly. That's a very, very good way of describing it, actually. Very good way of describing it.
Yeah. Well, the rest of the world, they are reacting. So, for example, I think last week or not that long ago, China, Japan, and South Korea, they had a ministry, I think a finance or commerce ministry meeting, which
Yeah.
haven't happened for quite a long time. And in that meeting, they talked a lot of things. And among others, they have been talking about how to respond to the tariffs wars in accordance. So, and of course, Macron said, although you have to take whatever Macron says with a grain of salt. Now, Macron says that he calls that there shouldn't be any investment to the United States. So some kind of a revenge or something. So what do you think the rest of the world will react to this moving forward?
Well, this is where we come back to the change in the world today. Today, America accounts for just 13% global demand, and I think that's an overestimate. By the way, I think that I think that exaggerate, and that may the real figure may be actually as little as half of that.
Mm-hmm.
So the rest of the world can get by without the United States. And I think one of the most hopeful things that has happened is finally Japan agreeing to speak with China about economic things. I mean, Japan has been on a very, very bad trajectory for a long, long time now. And finally, they're talking to China about these things. So, what the rest of the world needs to do is it needs to get to work round this foolish, lost country until it eventually comes to its senses.
Mm-hmm.
And, you develop Belt and Road, you build up the bricks, you set up the new financial systems, you do all of those things. And then eventually, as I said, when the rest of the world starts to get itself organized and its trading systems start working, which could be done very quickly, by the way. I mean, it's a mistake to think that this would take years. If it was done in a purposeful, intelligent way, then, as I said, it could work its way through very, very fast. Then the Americans will want to rejoin and they will perhaps come to the senses themselves and it will be better for them too. But that's what needs to happen. And it's not impossible. It can be done. Policies of economic revenge against the United States are pointless, in my opinion. I mean, what are they going to achieve? If they're successful, they will only intensify this absurd sense of victimization you already find in the United States. And I mean, they're a waste of time. Focus on doing all of these other things. China now has a huge economy. It's got its huge internal demand. It's got many friends around the world. Just go ahead and develop that and build on that. Asia has been hammered by these sanctions. So countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, for example, which had been, trying to sit on the fence. Well, now they see what America is really all about. I mean, Vietnam must be particularly angry, I would have thought, especially 46% tariffs on a developing economy, which has already been smashed by the United States in the 60s and early 70s, and which was previously basically sanctioned and embargoed by the United States, as I well remember, right through the 1980s. So, I mean, they've got an alternatives now. The alternatives are there. The framework is being built. Move forward and build on that. Interestingly, The Economist, staunchly pro-American neocon magazine as it is, actually sent some of its people to China just before these big tariff announcements. We all knew they were coming. And they found an atmosphere of confidence of people there thinking about the way forward. There's a whole article about this in The Economist, which I think people in China should read.
Okay. I'll look into it. Well, talking about that, I want to ask you about Wang Yi's visit to Russia. So Wang Yi was there just the other day, and he met with Lavrov and with Putin. Yeah, so the official reason for Wang Yi's visit is to prepare for Xi Jinping's visit early May, okay? But I wonder whether also for both Russia and China, there is a sense of at some point the world has to move on with or without United States. So they are working on that as well. So it's not just about preparing for Xi Jinping's visit or this event or that event. I think the two countries are probably doing some on a regular basis, a big task, which is they need to move on with or without the US. Is that true?
Absolutely. Now, the thing to say about Wang Yi's visit, first of all, is that it's a 3-day visit. So he was there for 3 days. He met with everybody that is important. He met with Putin. He met with Lavrov. He met with Ushakov. There are reports that he's even met with some of the economics people in Russia. So it was clearly not just to sort out the protocol arrangements for Xi Jinping's coming. So it was a very, very big visit. The second is that it got wall-to-wall coverage in the Russian media. I mean, this was something that a lot of attention was paid to his coming in Russia. And the language that came out of all of these meetings, is that the Russian-Chinese strategic partnership is, it is non-negotiable. Third parties cannot interfere with it. We're not going to accept any kind of interference. So Russia isn't going to be talked into abandoning China by the United States. China isn't going to be threatened into abandoning Russia by the United States. But there was something that they're saying now, which they've said before, but they're saying it more, is that this partnership is an anchor of stability in this incredibly volatile international system that we have now. So that these two great powers, the fact that they are friends, the fact that they're working together, that they're friends forever, as I think Wang Yi said, that is a stabilizing factor in international relations in terms of foreign policy and increasingly economic policy. Wang Yi, it is not a coincidence, I think, that he was in Moscow just before these tariff announcements from the United States. And by the way, I don't think it was a coincidence either that they took place, this visit took place at the same time that there were these big naval exercises in the Straits of Taiwan that China was conducting. Given that just before the visit, we had reports appearing in the American media, of which I am sure China was already aware before these reports, that Pete Hegseth has circulated within the Pentagon this big memorandum about how China is the great enemy and it must now be given number one priority over everything else. So the Russians know about it. The Chinese know about it. They understand that all that's happening is that America is scaling down in Europe and Ukraine, where it failed, so it can go back to its obsession, its current obsession with it, which is China. They know all about the tariffs that were coming. They know all about the threats, the further threats of mounting economic warfare against Russia. So they want to talk together. They want to make sure that at the highest level, each side understands what may be coming and that they are signaling to each other that the relationship is secure and stable, and that they are signaling to the world, the rest of the world, this is a stable relationship. It is the anchor in the international system. If you are looking for stability, if you're looking for predictability, if you're looking for rational decision making, you look to us.
Well, it's interesting you brought up Pete Hegseth's the memo that got leaked talking about China being the real enemy and almost like urged the whole Pentagon to prepare for war with China. That's more or less what he was saying. Well, Trump so far, whenever he was asked, okay, if China is going to so-called invade, I would use unification, but unify. But the U.S. media always saying when China invade, how can you invade yourself, right? When Taiwan is officially being regarded part of China. But anyway, so when
by
China
the United States, just to make that additional point.
Yeah. But so-called invasion, okay, if that happens, is the U.S. going to help Taiwan and guarantee some kind of a security guarantee? And Trump has constantly said it's not good. That's not going to happen because I'll make sure it's not happen, which means he declined to give that kind of a security guarantee. So far, that has been his answer. At the same time, we just say that Pete Hegseth had that memo. Not only that, he was recently visiting Japan, and this is what he said in it's called the honor ceremony on Iwo Jima. He said that we are here today because we have not forgotten the honor and the valor of our Japanese and American warriors, and we reaffirm the generous pledge. Our Marines, our soldiers, our sailors from both Japan and United States, their service and their sacrifice would never be forgotten. So without mentioning a word, the Japanese was fighting Americans. A brutal fight in Iwo Jima, right? The whole narrative now is, okay, we are big, friends, allies, so we're going to against China. Basically, he rewrite the history in a way, right? So I got a mixed message from the Trump administration, him versus Pete Hegseth. How do you explain that?
Well, I think the first thing to say is to talk about Pete Hegseth and what he said in Iwo Jima, because it is absolutely shocking. I mean, it's like a Russian general having a meeting with people in Germany and saying, our great blood brothers, the warriors of the SS, we must never forget them. We were, fighting alongside, we may have been fighting each other, but we had the warrior spirit on each side. I mean, it is such a terrible thing to say about what Japan was at that time and Japanese militarism and what that was all about. Such a betrayal of the sacrifice of all those American soldiers who fought against all of that. Such a betrayal of the wartime alliance between the United States and China. And again, it's essential to point this out. I mean, the Americans seem completely oblivious to the fact that China actually fought Japan much longer, fought a far greater part of the Japanese military than the United States ever did. I mean, I'm sorry to dwell on that, but it is true. I mean, there were millions of Japanese soldiers fighting in China far more than the United States ever fought at any one particular time. And anybody who knows what the Japanese were doing, anybody who knows what the Japanese were doing in China, anybody who knows what the Japanese were doing elsewhere in Asia would be absolutely horrified by these comments. And of course, the other thing it does is it lends support to the most sinister and dangerous forces within Japan itself. You know, the militarists, the people who want to rehabilitate the policies of the 1930s and well, no, not just the 1930s, the entire era of Japanese militarism and Japanese expansion. It was a terrible thing what Pete Hegseth said. And can I just say, because I used to work with a lot of Japanese people, including Japanese people who had fought in China during the Second World War and who were deeply remorseful about what they had done there. I mean, I remember some of them telling me that they couldn't sleep over it. I mean, that betrays them too, by the way. But Japan is not a monolith. There are different currents of thinking inside Japan. And as I said, again, Pete Hegseth, America, out of this anti-Chinese obsession, are lining up and supporting the worst ones, just as they've done the same in Ukraine, by the way, and in all sorts of other places. So this was an absolutely terrible thing. Now, about the administration itself, Donald Trump doesn't like wars. He thinks that they're expensive, that he probably has at some level an understanding that America has not actually done very well in any of its recent wars, going all the way back to the Second World War. It's never won a clear-cut victory against a peer opponent. I don't think he understands deeply about this, but he understands that wars don't work well for the United States. He probably also understands, because he's somebody who, whatever one may say about him, he goes out a lot to the American heartlands. He speaks to people there. He probably understands that war is not a popular policy with the American people. But at the same time, we have to face this reality. There is a militaristic strain within American society. There is a militaristic strain within the American government. They are deeply, deeply hostile to China at the moment. They've decided China is the great adversary. And they are talking about defending Taiwan and fighting for Taiwan, even though, as you absolutely correctly say, they recognize Taiwan already as part of China. So what's the point? So there it is. Now, there is an extra dimension to this, because I get the sense that Trump doesn't particularly like Taiwan, or at least the regime there. He sees them as having exploited the US as well. Taiwan was also hit by all of these tariffs, just to say, not as much as China was, but nonetheless also. He wants Taiwan to basically ship its entire semiconductor industry to the United States. So he also has there's that additional dimension for him. But if you're talking about, wider opinion within the American elite, at the moment, they're all about war with China, and they talk in that way. And I don't actually think America will go to war with China to defend Taiwan, just as they, in the end, didn't go to war with Russia to defend Ukraine. I think they understand that America would risk its own existence if it found itself in that kind of war. But of course, the separatists in Taiwan hear all of this rhetoric. They probably believe that America will indeed come and protect them. And as a result, they go on doing what they're doing. And of course, they're encouraged to do it by some people in the US, actively encouraged to do it by some people in the US who hate China.
Well, I agree with you that I think Trump doesn't like war, but at the same time, Pete Hegseth, for one thing, I think Pete, I don't know, I don't think he's he has a lot of depth of understanding of I think I saw at one point he had an interview talking about Taiwan. he actually believed China wanted to keep Taiwan is because TSMC, because of the semiconductor, which has
Yeah.
nothing, which is not true at all because China has
Yeah.
declared a part. I mean, Taiwan has been part of China from the beginning. China never changed the narrative long before TSMC, existed, right? Somehow.
No Chinese government, be it the Tsing, the Kuomintang,
Mhm.
Chiang Kai-shek. I always call him Chiang Kai-shek. I know
Uh,
he's called by a different name in China,
mm,
and of course the current government in China.
yeah,
No Chinese government has ever wavered in its belief
yeah,
that, well, its belief, in its knowledge,
yeah.
in its assertion that Taiwan is a part of China. It is ridiculous to think that this is going to, it's all about TMC.
Yeah.
Um, uh, One of the reasons for the quarrel between the Soviet Union and China in the 1950s is that the Chinese felt, correctly, by the way, that the Soviet Union wasn't providing China with the necessary backing in the 1950s to bring Taiwan back into the
Mhm.
homeland. I mean, people just do not get this in the West because they don't understand Chinese history or the
Mhm.
experience of what the Chinese people have been through and the way in which the Chinese people resent, not just resent, I mean, want to reverse, to reestablish as part of the revival of their country, the division of their country, which was forced upon it by the Western powers and Japan, by the way.
Mhm. Yeah, Pete Hegseth, and also I think Marco Rubio is another. I think these are all hawks against China. So
Mm,
so you see Trump himself against the war doesn't really want to have a war with China, yet he's surrounded by these people who I'm sure are
mm,
giving him hawkish ideas, pushing him. And you see, I don't know whether how long he can weather this. He can resist that because he is bombing Yemen. At one point, he was against bombing Yemen, I
yeah.
think. But now he's bombing Yemen because I don't know, somebody around him. And he's now, of course, talking constantly about bombing Iran. So how much he is truly fully can control his foreign policy team is my question.
Well, that's an excellent question. I mean, we saw in his first term that he couldn't in the end. That ultimately, even though he didn't want to, apparently, he ended up sending weapons to Ukraine, for example.
Uh-huh.
He
Uh-huh.
reversed the policy, Obama's policy on Ukraine, and started arming Ukraine, leading us directly to the point that we are now. The same, I suspect, with Iran, the Houthis, all of this. He may not want war, but he's never come out sufficiently strongly and told all these people around him, we're not into war. This is not our policy. We look after the United States and the United States alone. He's never had
Mhm.
the courage or perhaps even the conviction to say that. And until he does, and unless he does, which I don't believe he ever will, by the way, then he will always be drawn back into conflicts, this time against the Houthis, possibly against Iran, all of
Mhm.
those, and conceivably one day against China,
Mhm.
even though at some level he probably doesn't want them.
Now, you in the Duran, you repeatedly said that in the end, the neocons, they always win. Okay,
Yeah,
whatever the decision is, it seems like the neocons always win. Why
yeah,
is that they always win? You see, when we look at this signals chat scandal, right? You can tell JD Vance is skeptical about bombing Yemen. Okay,
mm,
but he was overridden by Pete Hegseth, just like that.
mm,
And then I also read at some point of when they were making decisions about bombing Libya, for example, how they did was they had a meeting. So Obama and the Gates, I think at the time the Department Secretary of the Defense was the Gates, Bob Gates, and then Biden. The three of them had a telephone conference with Hillary Clinton, who was at the time in Brussels, and she just had a conversation with the Libyan rebel. Of course, that person would tell her all the horror stories because he wanted the US to come into Libya to help him, to get rid of Muammar Gaddafi. So they had this meeting, and Hillary Clinton is the one person who wanted to bomb Libya. All the other
mm.
three guys, Bob Gates, um, Joe Biden, and Barack Obama, they were all skeptical about bombing Libya. But in the end, Hillary Clinton prevailed.
No.
Whatever the reason, I think there's some dynamics. The three guys don't want to override a woman or something. I don't know. But whatever the reason, she prevailed. She's the hawkish one, and she prevailed.
Yeah.
And J.D. Vance was overridden by Hegseth. Why is it that the neocons, they always win? Why is it?
Right. Right. I think there's two reasons. First of all, the neocons have been very, very successful in representing any doubts, any skepticism about the use of American power, military power, as somehow skepticism about the United States itself. So if you say, look, we shouldn't get involved in Libya, we shouldn't get involved in Yemen, we shouldn't fight Iran, we shouldn't fight China, it's you don't believe in the United States. You don't believe in our virtue, in our strength. You are somehow betraying the United States, the idea of the United States. And people are very, very intimidated by this. And I think that this is something that, especially given the lock grip that America has, that the neocons have over the media in the United States, as I said, at a certain specific level, psychological level, skeptics like Vance, Obama, and whomever find it very, very difficult to argue against that. But there is another factor, and it's a very simple, very practical, very material factor, which is that behind the neocons, there is this vast armaments industry in the United States, which pours out the money into the various think tanks, which lobbies the Congress people, which has its contacts with the defense contractors and the people inside the Pentagon. There is this huge business and industry in the United States, which has this lock grip on people in Washington. And it always advocates war. It doesn't want compromise because its entire existence is based around war and encouraging war and getting defense spending high and higher still and finding enemies to fight in all sorts of places, either from the military industrial lobby or its political allies, then you're not going to win elections. It's as simple as that. And that always gives them a massive advantage in any argument in Washington.
Okay, so Elon Musk is supposed to leave at the end of May or something. What is your assessment on the whole role the Doge played? Did it do any, I mean, does it change anything? Does it play any significant role to change American for the better or something? What is your assessment on that?
My own assessment of Doge is that it's essentially failed. I mean, the fact that Elon Musk is leaving the scene, quitting the scene, is a clear sign that the bureaucracy has won. I mean, any idea that an institution like Doge has achieved its objectives in 130 days is ridiculous, given the size of the American government. So it is the defeat of Elon Musk and the defeat of the key part of Trump's reform agenda. But what Doge did achieve, and it's important, but not in terms of American internal developments, but for those of us who follow the United States and those in foreign governments that need to understand the United States, is that it briefly pulled the curtain. So we saw an awful lot about the internal realities of how the American government works. The fact that its budget is completely out of control, for example, and will continue to be. The fact that it is overspending recklessly, which is the real cause, by the way, of America's problems, not China's competition or anything of that. Jeffrey Sachs has written to me about this, and we're going to do a program with him. He said that America will very soon have a deficit again, a trade deficit again, despite the fact that it's putting up all of these tariffs, because it chronically overspends. And that overspending can only be satisfied by an insatiable demand of goods from outside. That's why. So anyway, we've seen the curtain drawn. We've seen how out of control, how profoundly corrupt the American system has become. It will provide food for analysts and historians, extending far into the future. But in terms of American politics and American policy, it's been an episode which has changed nothing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if nothing else, if you look at the what Trump, he can't even like just keep the level of military spending the same. He has to
No,
increase it, right? So I
exactly.
think just that alone, I think it tells you
Yes.
how much Doge has failed. Yeah.
Yes.
And not to mention, I think Elon Musk himself personally paid some price for it, right? His
Oh
company is
yeah.
not doing well, so and people hate him. You know, there's a huge,
Yeah.
a lot of people hate him.
Well,
So
there's been a massive, vicious campaign against him,
yeah,
which has
yeah.
had its effect. I mean,
Mhm.
I've seen cars, Teslas, in London with people putting pictures on them. I think I hate Elon too. I
Mm.
mean, because people are afraid for their cars, which is bizarre actually.
Mm. Yeah,
But it's had that effect.
yeah. Now, on the Democratic side, so we talked about this that there is no real leader in the Democratic Party now. So
Mm.
one thing happened is Cory Booker,
Yeah.
the the senator from New Jersey, he did this filibuster for 25
Mm.
hours straight talk. Now it's very impressive that he's doing that right without a break. He was just standing there talking. But here's my question. Now, filibuster, my understanding is if there is a bill that is going to go for a vote, you do the filibuster to stop the vote because you hate it so much, and yet you know you don't have the vote to vote against it. So this is your way as a minority to express your
Mm.
frustration, your determination to stop the bill.
Mm.
Here he didn't even have a bill. He just talk
No,
about
exactly.
how bad Trump is and Doge is and the Republican Party is. So he just keep on talking. So is this just a purely political theater to get attention? Is that what he's doing?
That's exactly what he's doing. That is all it is. There is manoeuvring within the Democratic Party as to who's going to be the great leader, who's going to take the cause forward in 2028, and that's what Cory Broker has done. He's put himself politically on the map. Here in London, by the way, the people who want to see a Democrat challenge in 2028 are in ecstasies about this. There've been euphoric articles about, this heroic man who did this extraordinary thing, spoke for 25 hours, telling us all about what a terrible man Donald Trump is. There it is.
The filibuster itself, I find it interesting. Now, does Britain have something similar, just so the minority can stop a bill? I mean, that's the whole
No,
purpose of filibuster. So Britain
yes,
doesn't have
no,
one.
no, it
Okay,
doesn't.
so it's a
The Parliament is very tightly controlled here. I mean, disregard the fact that when you see film of Parliament, I mean, you see all these people, heckling and shouting and all of that, but there are very, very tight rules about what you can do. And the Speaker of the House of Commons, who is in charge of enforcing the rules, if somebody tries to do something like that, engage in a filibuster, they will simply ask him to leave the room and he will be escorted out. So it can't happen. Absolutely not. In Britain, the government, provided it has a majority, controls the House of Commons.
Mhm. Okay. I mean, it's an interesting phenomenon. So I had an episode to tell my audience to explain, what this is. It
Yeah.
got lots of attention simply because people,
Mm.
very impressed by him standing there for 25 straight hours, just physically very demanding, right? But what's the purpose? You need to have a purpose to do something like that. And so anyway, um,
It serves, it's pure politics, it's pure theater. It's politics reduced to performance art.
yeah.
That's all it is.
Okay, Europe. One thing that the Russian media report reported that the former Italian Prime Minister Massimo D'Alema, he supposedly
Yeah.
at the request of Zelensky went to China and Brazil to seek help.
Mm,
This was last year before I think the election even. So even at that point, it seemed like Zelensky knew that America will sooner or later stop
mm,
supporting Ukraine, and he didn't trust the Europeans. So he knew what is coming, right? What is your
mm.
take on that?
Yeah. No, it's a very interesting development, actually. And it's interesting, by the way, that he didn't go himself or send a Ukrainian official. He found a former Italian politician to
Mhm.
act as his messenger, which points to the fact that he's come to realize that Ukrainian diplomats aren't very good, and that somebody's told him that he himself doesn't go down very well with
Mhm.
some foreign leaders. Now, China and Brazil formed this Friends of Peace group at the United Nations. They have been coordinating their positions on trying to work out a Ukrainian settlement, and of course they're both BRICS member states. And the Russians see both of these countries as friends, especially China, but also Brazil.
Mhm.
So it's understandable that Zelensky would say to himself, well, look, the Americans may change soon. I am losing the war because he
Mhm.
is. I am. I've seen that the Europeans can't offer me something. I've got to try and put pressure on the Russians, or at least get somebody to talk to the Russians, to bring the Russians to the table. And who better than China and Brazil, who have this influence over Russia? The trouble is, Zelensky sends these envoys, and as I said, it's interesting that he chose an Italian one, but they never come with anything that leaders in China and Brazil, or indeed even the United States now, can really use,
Mhm.
because he's never willing to make any real compromise on anything. He
Mhm.
still demands all the territories. He still demands that Ukraine be allowed to enter NATO. He insists that the Russians should at some point pay reparations, that they should agree to their generals and even Putin himself being put on trial. He's never really, well, he never has, not really, he never has retreated from any of this. So it seems that Lula actually refused to meet this man.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, that's what I read, that Lula's basically saying this is the problem the United States, you and the United States should deal
Yeah.
with. We're not part of that. And China seems nicer to them, but China pretty much have the same message, you need to know what you need to you need to do, right?
Yeah.
You need to be able
Well,
to compromise before you talk to us. Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
absolutely. Well, of course, the Chinese have infinite patience,
Mm.
and they are, by the way, contrary to all the wolf warrior nonsense that you hear about, they are very polite people.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
the degree of self-restraint that you see from
Yeah.
Chinese diplomats is extraordinary, all things considered. Much more self-restrained, by the way, than the Russians are. The
Hmm.
Russians can
Hmm.
be pretty bullying at times, just to say, or at
Yeah.
least bombastic at times. The Chinese are not.
Yeah.
Um, in Brazil, it's different. Now, Lula has apparently he has never forgiven an incident that happened at a G7 meeting in, I think it was Tokyo, and I think it was in
Hmm.
2023, which is that Lula and Modi had been invited to this G7 meeting, and as had Zelensky. And Zelensky asked to meet Modi and Lula, and Zelensky and Modi and Lula agreed to meet him and put aside time to meet him. So Zelensky met Modi, and apparently the meeting went very badly. And then Lula was waiting to meet Zelensky, and Zelensky didn't turn up. And Lula was apparently furious about this
Hmm.
and has never forgiven Zelensky for it, and has never received an apology from Zelensky about it either, by the way.
Yeah. Sometimes you wonder what they're thinking, right? And how can you do something like
Yeah.
that and not
I mean,
apologize?
Exactly. Zelensky has been pretty rude to the
Yeah, yeah,
Chinese as well. I mean,
yeah.
he's been, but as I said, China seems to have this ability to just absorb this and
Uh-huh.
nonetheless keep going. How long they'll do it is another question, of course.
One thing, the other day I saw somewhere what I found interesting is that Marco Rubio being the Secretary of State. He is now currently sanctioned by both China and Russia. So how can you conduct
Oh, really?
how, how can he conduct diplomacy when he is now sanctioned both by China and Russia? How does it work?
Well, there you go. How does it work exactly? I mean, the Americans never think of these things. I mean, they always assume that everybody wants to talk to them. Um, I remember again that there was this is back in Obama's time that Putin was invited to attend a meeting where Obama was, and that Obama. This is actually I remember now. Medvedev was the president. Putin. No, it was the other way around. Anyway,
Mhm.
Putin didn't go, and he sent his prime minister, who was Medvedev instead. And the Americans were stunned. They were shocked that a foreign leader didn't want to meet the president of the United States. He would turn down an invitation. So this is very much the American attitude that everybody must speak to us. Everybody yearns to speak to us. If Kim Jong Un has a meeting
Mhm.
with the American President Donald Trump, this is somehow a massive benefit extended by the Americans to Kim Jong Un. The mere fact that he's having a meeting is a benefit. That the rest of the world doesn't actually think like that is something that Americans never can bring themselves to understand.
Well, what I don't understand is like Marco Rubio, the reason he was sanctioned by China is he was lying about what happened in Xinjiang, and that of course China take it very seriously. I think he did that when he probably was still as a senator, and then even recently he was lying. He was talking about he visited I forgot which country in Africa, and he said those train was built by China, and it was so bumpy that he almost threw up or something like that. Turns out that railroad was not built by China, and that African country even said that's not built by China. But
Yeah,
he just this and he didn't apologize. He didn't say, "Oops, I got it wrong." No, he didn't apologize for any of that.
no.
He just kept on lying. So does he understand what diplomacy really means? And he's now under the sanction. He should be at least not make it worse, right? He doesn't care.
Americans have no understanding what diplomacy means. Now, I don't want to go through all of the negotiations that have taken place over the last few weeks between the Americans and the Russians, but the Russians, who do understand diplomacy, I mean, they do it all the time, obviously, they are absolutely bewildered by it. I mean, they really are. I mean, meetings are convened, and the Americans come without any kind of preparation or agenda. This is apparently what happened at the first Russian American meeting. The second one, the Russians discovered that the Americans had invited the Ukrainians to turn up without telling them in advance. Um, Anybody who tries to conduct diplomacy with the Americans finds it's all but impossible, because the Americans, who did once upon a time do diplomacy, I mean, Kissinger did diplomacy.
Mhm.
Kissinger did diplomacy when he came to China in the early 70s. But today, the Americans have completely lost those skills. What I am saying now is open. I've said it on programs, but I have some I don't speak to anybody directly in the American government, but I do speak to some people who are connected to the
Mhm.
American government. And I said, look, if you cannot find diplomats who are able to conduct negotiations, if you don't know how to do diplomacy, then here's a suggestion. Why don't you speak to some of the old veterans who did? People
Mhm.
like Chas Freeman, for
Mhm.
example,
Mhm.
and get their advice. And also, why don't you go to the big law firms and start recruiting some lawyers?
Mhm.
Because diplomacy has something like litigation, because litigation involves an awful lot of negotiation. And they're not going to be as good as diplomats, but at least they have some of the skills, and maybe they can build up some more. Because America doesn't have a clue how to conduct diplomacy. And lying, I'm afraid, is something that the Americans have been doing for a very, very long time. And they do it constantly. And I mean, Putin even once said that they're the empire of lies. It's true enough.
It's true. Yeah, I agree. Yeah. I don't know what Marco Rubio is thinking, right? He's now sanctioned by both Russia and China. And if I were him, I would try to mitigate, trying to be softer. So hopefully those two countries can, considering lift the sanction. No, he's doubling down. He's making it worse. Anyway.
Well, absolutely. I should say there's one of the earliest manuals on how to conduct diplomacy written by a French diplomat at the beginning of the 18th century, when European diplomacy was first starting. He said, whatever you do, never lie. Never lie if you're a diplomat. He said, sometimes if you lie, you will gain a temporary advantage, but you will always leave poison behind you. That is, as I said, that's one of the earliest rules of diplomacy. Does anybody pay any attention in America? No.
No. Yeah. Marian Le Pan, she was found guilty of embezzlement of the EU fund. And it's so obvious that the whole purpose is because she is now banned for running I think not just the running for president, running for any office, I guess, for 5 years. So it's so clear what this whole trial is about. What is your take on this?
Well, you just asked. Well, I agree. Let me put it like this. I mean, can I just say something? I mean, I am absolutely confident that Marine Le Pen committed this crime. I mean, I have no doubt about it. I used to live in France. I used to know French politics very, very well. The kind of corruption she engaged in is the kind of corruption that every French political leader of any level engages in. French politics is profoundly, deeply corrupt in this fashion. I understand that the current Prime Minister of France, Monsieur Barrot, did exactly the same thing that Marine Le Pen did. He used money provided by the EU for his assistants in the European Parliament, and he used that money to help them do work in France itself. So there's nothing unusual in this. This prosecution, like many other prosecutions in France, was directed at Marine Le Pen in order to knock her out of French politics, because she's seen as a non-system politician, an opposition politician to the current establishment. And at the same time, there's a serious risk now that she might win the elections in 2027. And that is something that cannot be allowed. It's as simple as that.
How do you feel about elections in general now? We see more and more these kind of things happening. Like Romania, they canceled the election because they thought that the so-called far-right person might win. And Erdogan, we talked about last time, I think he arrested his political opponent, at least find some ways to cancel that person. Marcos Jr. in the Philippines, he arrested Duterte and even sent him to Hague, even though the Philippines, my understanding, is not even part of the ICC. So all these things are going on. It's getting more and more, it seems to me like the elections are getting more and more destructive and become brutal, the fightings. I myself has always been skeptical with elections because elections are so easy to be, manipulated and cheated, and all kinds of things you can do. What is your take on all these things going on with elections?
Well, I mean, elections in the West were always conducted within certain basic rules. I mean, it's important to say this. I mean, there was always this expression in Britain, a rather cynical expression, that elections were a great threat, were a great thing until they actually mattered. I mean, if people really exercised the real right of choice, they would do away with them. Well, we've come very close to that point now, because it seems to me that at least when I first came to Britain in the 60s and in the 70s, there were choices, there were differences between the parties. The Labour Party in Britain at that time was indeed a party that represented working class people, that had a working class agenda, that talked about socialism, and things of that kind. And the Conservatives were much more obviously the party of the middle class, of capital, of free markets, of that kind of thing. So there was a kind of tension that has been eliminated today in the West. We have a situation in the West, at least in Europe, where if you do not agree with the conventional orthodoxies of the political class, means will be found to exclude you. I will give an example close to home. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn's career was destroyed in Britain. I mean, he was for things that he was completely innocent of. I mean, the idea of Corbyn as any kind of anti-Semite, to anybody who knows him, is absurd. But it was used against him, weaponized against him, and it was used very, very effectively, and all kinds of things. So it's very difficult to have, well, it's impossible to have any more proper electoral politics in the way that, even in the way that used to exist 40, 50 years ago. Now, there is a result of this. Now, this morning, my wife and I had a conversation. My wife, as you know, is an academic. She was contacted by one of her ex-students, and they met yesterday because the student wanted to see her again. He's a young man of 23. He's in contact with many of his friends. He told my wife that neither he nor any of his friends vote in elections anymore. I mean, you know, this is because as far as they are concerned, elections don't make any difference. The entire youth of, and this isn't just true in Britain, the youth in Europe are simply dropping out of politics because they no longer believe that politics is relevant to their lives and will change anything in their lives. And one of the other tragedies is that it's not by the way because they're not interested in politics. I'm talking about, you know, the political system. I mean, they may be very radical in their political views, but they don't expect any longer that radicalism will ever find any response from within the political system. And that is an incredibly dangerous situation. It means that people have become completely alienated from the political process. And of course, to assume that they will want to defend it is absurd. So if we ever have a really sinister danger to it from outside, well, you know, who knows what will happen.
Yeah, I mean, I voted with the last election, but I voted the third party. I voted for you know, that woman. I forgot her name. I didn't vote for Trump or Biden because I didn't think it will make any difference. But you know, so I voted just because I feel like I still need to vote. But and I told my husband if there's no one that I can vote, I can always write in myself. You know, so that's how I vote.
I am exactly the same. I mean, I'll disclose to your viewers. I mean, I used to be a member of the British Labour Party. I was very committed to it. I'm obviously somebody who takes a great interest in politics. If there was an election in Britain tomorrow, I cannot imagine myself voting, certainly not for the Labour Party, but for any of the other parties, any of the other main parties too. I mean, last time I voted, I spoiled my ballot. I put the cross. You know, you in Britain when you vote, you put a cross next to the candidate that you want to win. I put a cross over several, knowing that as a result the ballot would be spoiled.
Yeah, Jill Stein. I voted for Jill Stein. Yeah, I know she won't be elected, so,
Yeah.
so
Yeah,
that's a
I know, and I like I met Jill Stein, by the way, and I like her.
yeah.
And if it was if I was in the United States, quite plausibly, she would be the person I would vote for.
One thing also happening in Britain, British Steel was closed after the British government declined to help, which is they have money to go to Ukraine, but they don't have money to rescue their own steel company. Okay, that's interesting. In the same time, at the same time, also Germany also demolished its most advanced coal plant. It's they spent $3 billion to build it, and it's lasted only 6 years. So it should have years to go, but they demolished it, whatever the reason. And last year, the Dutch Senate, they voted to permanently halt the natural gas production. Seems to me Europe, these European countries, at some point these are all industry powerhouse, right? They decided to speed up their own deindustrialization. Is that what's going on in Europe now?
That is exactly what's going on in Europe, and it's astonishing. And you're absolutely right. It is bewildering again to the people of Europe. People in Europe don't understand it. I don't understand it fully. And we come back to your previous point. I mean, we vote for different parties, but the policy remains the same. It remains as destructive as always. So, British Steel, I mean, I can remember how important it was in the 60s and 70s in Britain to preserve a steel industry. I mean, it used to be something that used to dominate the media. The most extraordinary thing about the collapse, the extinction of the British steel industry is that it's more noticed and talked about in China than it is here. I mean,
Yeah.
it's true.
Yes. Yeah. Because it's stunning. Because that
Yeah.
the British government refused to step in and to bail out. At the same time, you're sending money to Ukraine, right? So yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Tomorrow I think is the deadline for TikTok ban that the extension by Donald Trump. I think it's 75 days, and it's tomorrow. I believe is the deadline. Trump keep on saying that there is a deal, that coming and something. But what's interesting to me is that China hasn't said a word. It's all coming
No.
from the US side. So do you believe there will be a deal? What do you think is going to happen if we want to be speculative a little bit?
I don't think there's going to be a deal. And I'm going to say straight away, it's exactly the same that I'm seeing with Ukraine. Trump and his acolytes are always saying there's a deal round the corner going to happen over Ukraine. The Russians say, "What deal? We're not even talking about a deal. What do you mean a deal?" And I think the Chinese are taking an even more strong line. They're saying, let the man talk. The reality is, we are not in discussions with him. So I don't think there's going to be a deal. Because what is the compromise?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
what is China supposed to, I mean, the deal he wants is one where China hands over TikTok. Basically, I mean, that's the only deal he's going to accept. So why should China do that? If he wants to take it, let him take it, but let's not give it to him. That's my own sense of this.
Yeah, he has been dangling this tariff thing. I think one of the things he said, he basically said that if there is a negotiation, if there is a problem from China's side, I can lower the tariffs. So I'll give you something in return for you to allow us to acquire TikTok. But the problem with that is, well, tariffs is you control the tariffs. You can lower the tariffs today, and once the deal is done, you can always increase it again. So what's the guarantee
Correct.
there, right?
Well, that's exact. I mean, it's black. That is accepting. That is accepting blackmail. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
exactly the tactic that blackmailers use. Oh, I'm your friend. I've had to do all of this very thing. But of course, if you give me what I want, well, I can be reasonable.
Yeah,
He's not going to be reasonable. As you absolutely rightly say, he'll knock the tariffs down a few points, and then he'll say, well, the Chinese are doing something else which I don't like, so I'm going to put the tariffs up again. But of course, I'm always ready to deal again. I mean, you can't work with someone who is like that.
The last thing I just want to share with you, there is a social media person. I think
Mm,
his channel's name is ishaowspeed. I don't know exactly his name, but he has like a 37 million followers, subscribers on YouTube. So he's
mm,
a big guy. I mean, big. He's very young. He's only 20 years old. He started as a
mm.
playing the game and live stream that. Uh, but he's in China and he has been live streamed from China like long hours, 6 hours, and in Beijing, in Shanghai, and in between, and all that.
Wow.
Apparently, that brought lots of people watching, and many you reading from the comments, a lot of people are shocked by what they see because they're being propagandized in the West and believe China is very backward
Mm,
and very dirty and
mm,
very poor and
mm.
stuff like that. But so it's the modern China that they see are they're stunned by that. So that is
Yes,
a big
absolutely.
topic in China. And I think these kind of things probably going to happen more and more. I think more people,
Yeah.
not just with his show, there are a lot of people say, okay, I need to go to China, see it myself. So more people will
Yeah.
go and more people will do the live stream and they will do, programs about China. Then people
Mm,
will learn China more. So I think there is a hope there that because of
yes.
decline of the legacy media, these kind
Yeah.
of a new media are helping people to know the truth better. Don't you think?
It is absolutely true, and it will happen. Don't underestimate the obstacles that would be put in the path.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Now, for example, and I just give a few examples because exactly the same happened with Russia. There was the
Uh-huh.
2018 World Cup. The British government didn't want people, particularly football supporters, young people, to go to Russia to see it for itself, to
Uh-huh.
go to Moscow and to all the other cities. Um, the Skripal affair was organized because that was exactly what happened before the World Cup. Then there were restrictions placed on Britons who were able to go.
Mhm.
Those Britons who did go were stunned in exactly the same way. They said, my God, this is a modern country. It's not what we were led to think. But then a few years later, the very first thing that the EU does is it imposes a travel ban. It
Mhm. Uh-huh.
stops
Uh-huh.
Russian airlines flying people to Europe and prevents basically movement between these two countries. Now, of course, between these two places. Now,
Uh-huh.
of course, that isn't going to endure. And already you're starting to see more and more YouTube channels by British expats, for
Mhm.
example, in Russia, doing programs about what life is really like there. And they are starting to attract some numbers of views. And I think it'll be much, much more difficult to do the same kind of blockade, inflammation blockade on China
Mhm.
for two reasons. Firstly, China is so much bigger.
Yeah.
I mean, so much bigger. And secondly, there are the big Chinese communities around the world, and they
Mhm.
will
Mhm.
insist on their right to travel to China. And they are important constituencies within their own countries. So it can't be done in the same way. And over time, I think you are right. You're absolutely right. Legacy media is dying.
Mhm.
Social media, citizen media is taking its place, but there are restrictions all the time. I am sure that what you say will come, but it will not be easy and it will
Yeah.
not be smooth. It will
Yeah.
take time to work its way through.
Yeah, I mean the Canadian government actually in their travel guidelines about China, they actually put it there that China is very dangerous to warn people, basically telling you not to go. It doesn't say don't go, but it says, be aware, there are a lot of crimes and there's, those sort of things. So that's what the Canadian government
It's very
is telling
dangerous.
you.
You might go there and come back with all the wrong ideas. It's very, very dangerous.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Okay, let's talk next week again. And great.
Okay, then.
Thank you.
See you then, Sophia. Bye.
Bye.